Greetings, everybody. This is Christopher Messina coming at you from the Messy Time Studios here in the bright sunshine coast of Florida. It is the 3rd of August, 2022, and I am joined, as luck would have it, just down the coast by Kurt Wuckert Jr., who is deep knowledge in the crypto space and Bitcoin in particular. And we got acquainted recently and started chatting. And given the fact that he knows far more about this than I do, I am delighted to have him here. Kurt, thanks so much for coming on.
Happy to be here, man. Thanks for having me out.
So we were just chatting briefly earlier in what passes for the green room in podcasting world. Both northerners by birth and have grown tired of hacking ice off of cars in the middle of January to get them moving, and have come down to the last free state in America, Florida. So living here under the delightful reign of August King DeSantis. We won't get into that. But we're just touching briefly. So many folks. I come out of traditional Wall Street and commodities background in mining, hard rock mining, where we dig stuff out of the ground. And more people, of course, it's hard not to hear about, Bitcoin and mining and the rest of it. Maybe if you could give us as brief a background as you can of how you got involved and when and kind of what you've seen, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. My Bitcoin journey starts in 2012. I had a printing company that I owned outside of Chicago, and I had a guy came to me and asked for me to print him a couple of posters, a little job, probably $100 job, and offered to pay me in Bitcoin. And I didn't know what the hell Bitcoin was, so I asked him, and he said, Kurt, it's kind of like video game money that you can use to buy other stuff in games. And I was like, I'm not much of a gamer, but whatever. Like, he was a nice guy, and it was a curiosity to me. And since it was a relatively small job, I said, yeah, that's fine, let's do it. And I kind of shelved it. I synced up a wallet and took some Bitcoin, and then probably 6 months later, I decided to go down the rabbit hole after a couple of people continued to bring it up. All of a sudden, the bull market started, and I think the next person to probably mention it was my brother. My brother had just taken a side gig with a guy who wanted to pay him in Bitcoin, and so that was it. I'm like, okay, I got to figure this thing out now. I've heard about it twice, and that's a thing. And I just went full bore down the rabbit hole. By the end of 2013, I had built up a small and mostly unsuccessful mining operation. We were working on various, wallet technology and some other stuff. And I started going to meetups. And Chicago had a robust Bitcoin meetup culture. And so, I used to pop in, not a ton, but I would go. And just really fell in love with the culture, fell in love with the idea, really dug into the nuts and bolts. Why Bitcoin? How Bitcoin? When Bitcoin? Something.
When Bitcoin? If Bitcoin?
Right. And I just fell in love with it. I just thought it was so cool. This notion of being able to tokenize assets and make simple payments and monetize whatever other economic activity you were doing in really simple ways. And for me, that was always the major curiosity. Is I was a hard assets guy. I was a precious metals guy. I loved commodities. I wanted to see money be re-standardized with a gold standard or a silver standard or something like that. So I had my own money theories that I brought to the table.
And just curious, it's interesting. Was that a predominantly shared view in the group that you knew in Chicago then, or was that one of many different ideas of why people were so interested in this?
At the time, yes. I think at the time, nearly everybody was coming at it from a very libertarian standpoint. The big influences at the time were guys like Roger Ver and Andreas Antonopoulos, and they were consistently it was about freedom. It was money that couldn't be debased, and therefore allows us to be to live out these theories that came out of the Mises Institute and things like that. And so that was just the culture until all of a sudden things shifted, though. In 2014 and 15, the culture got very it was after the Mt. Gox collapse, and then the culture turned into well, it doesn't matter that the price collapsed, you should just be accumulating it. It became this weird scarcity cult very quickly. Which we still see today, hodl, buy the dip, these simple axioms about why you should invest in Bitcoin rather than here are these things we can disrupt economically with Bitcoin as like a business tool. And so, that was all well and good. I'm happy to disagree with people, and I was happy to debate, and got myself just, tangled up as a big blocker and saying, hey, I think Bitcoin XT, which was the big block implementation of the time, I think it's a good thing. I agree with Mike Hearn and Gavin Andreessen, who were two of the most influential Bitcoin core developers at the time. And then I got married in 2015, and I took a little bit of a break.
Mazel tov to that. Very quickly, for those of my listeners who will have heard some of this, but the phrase big blocker will go boom right over their heads. What does that mean?
So I believe that the reconciliation period in Bitcoin, which is every 10 minutes a block is written, I believe that block size should be decided by economic demand. And this is a very unpopular opinion. The consensus opinion about Bitcoin is that protocol developers and the Bitcoin community should set an arbitrary protocol limit that does not allow more than 1 megabyte per block, which for me, I treat that as that's economic planning. This is very kind of Soviet Politburo kind of stuff. And
so today's Washington D.C. basically, they were ahead of the game.
Right. It's financial engineering. It's like it's
explain,
like the Fed.
Explain why that is. That's very curious. That seems like a very deep sort of acupuncture point. Why is that the limitation of the block size every 10 minutes, an arbitrary limit versus just letting the market decide how large it is? Why is that an economic or a monetary phenomenon rather than a coding phenomenon?
So from a code standpoint, Bitcoin can do anything. Like there's nothing that says there is anything, the 21 million Bitcoin hard limit, and all these things, these axioms about Bitcoin that everyone talks about are absolute. Like Bitcoin can never be double spent. Bitcoin can never be, X, Y, and Z. There's all these axioms. They're all false. Bitcoin can absolutely do all kinds of things that the advocates say that it can't. And the only thing that stops it is the incentive. It's the balanced incentives of the network itself. So it's the investors and, okay, how much of my own capital am I willing to risk for this fight versus the miners, for example, that in many cases have billions of dollars in hardware invested in the infrastructure of the network, saying like, yeah, we're going to take a risk and make this contentious change, like that kind of thing. And so, it's just like anything else. Like you can take an American political position and say like, can you ban guns in the United States? Like, well, you could probably pass that law, but then what are the spillover effects of enforcement and everything else, right? So
you can write any law you want. It was kind of like Woody Allen and bananas when they finally took over the country. From now on, everyone under 13 will be 13.
Correct. So right.
So you can deny reality basically by saying I'm putting arbitrary constraints on something and I'm going to kind of will it into existence, even though there's a fundamental reason for it to work.
And it's actually very political. We see the same kind of. I call the small blocker community, these 1 megabyte block size maximalists. I call them the social justice warriors of Bitcoin, because when you
that's the greatest thing I've heard all year. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Just so you know, 2022 just peaked for me. Go ahead. Maybe we have further heights to scale.
Yes. And that's exactly it. When I say like, hey, I would like to build a block that has 40,000 transactions in it. I mean, it is like laser eyes, NPC army screaming, like literally the bot accounts turn up on the internet. It's everything. It's like I just said that, a man is a man and a woman is a woman over at like, Vice.
Yeah, I get this. I want to hone in on this because I love this. I remember a good friend of mine who was a professor. I studied anthropology at the University of Chicago, and one of my professors there, in describing an argument that had been going on at the American Anthropological Association and in journals and such like at the time, he said, "Remember, the fights in academia are so vicious because the stakes are so low." Right, and it's kind of an interesting point, right? But the stakes here in Bitcoin, can be very high. So this is very important. This is a very interesting dynamic. It's like, to me, you're describing the fights between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks in the 1919 Russian Revolution,
And
right?
an example that I use regularly, by the
Oh,
way.
look at that!
Yeah.
Perfect. Good. Good. Mismanagement of history is the tool not only of the left. So, so you're a big block maximalist, or they're, they've got picked arbitrary, and the difference
Small
is
blockers,
what?
yeah.
Let's take it one at a time. In code terms, what does that actually mean? If you're restricted, you're
one
not
line of
restricted.
code. So there's a max block size. So when in every transaction, so there's script language that explains the rules of each block, and then all of the nodes on the network validate that the rules are being followed. From a code standpoint, it's one line of code. It's literally max block size equals less than X, which it's actually a megabyte, but there's asterisk
Right.
also, because there are some tricks that are played with soft forks to make it that, in a very technical sense, under flawless conditions, a BTC block could be a little bit less than 4 megabytes. But in the wild, we've never seen it over 3, and the average block size is about a megabyte and a half. So if you cannot fit your transactions in that megabyte and a half, or whatever else you're doing on the network, you either need to pay a higher fee to push someone else out of your way, or you just need to wait until the mempool is low value enough for your transaction to get processed.
And that could it's either like with anything else, you're paying with time or money. So this would be the equivalent, although it's different protocol, I gather. But this would be the equivalent why sometimes gas fees in Ethereum are so insanely high and other times they're not.
It's a similar problem. It has, from a technical standpoint, it's actually it's quite different from a coding standpoint, but from an economic standpoint, it's the same thing. There's too much demand for the available supply. And the reason I make this like financial planning, or like a Bolshevik standpoint, like we're going to plan the right economy. It's like saying there will only be 1 train an hour from Moscow to St. Petersburg.
Right.
And it doesn't matter if the population triples or quadruples or whatever. There will be one
People
train
lined up out the door trying to get on the train.
Exactly. So if you need to get on that train, the ticket obviously continues to get more and more expensive, and all these other things. And this is the economic planning that has gone into BTC, the typical what people think of as Bitcoin.
And so that is, and we're going to jump around a little bit, is that and related issues like that why the proponents of BSV, which I'm taking to call classical flavor Bitcoin. I don't know if that's going to catch on or not, but is that part of the reason that folks like Craig Wright and others are saying BSV is going to solve the problems of BTC, and that's what they mean when they say there are problems with BTC.
Correct. It's you can't build a world that can scale if you try to build it on a money that cannot scale. And so in my train example, the difference would be a completely deregulated, between Chicago and New York, for example, and say, well, okay, if over a generation, the populations of those cities goes up by 10 times, we would expect various competing train companies to create more efficient rail, more efficient cars, add more cars per engine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like essentially the free market will actually solve this problem if we let it. And but we are looked at as,
is it okay to say that during this administration? Is that okay?
just barely for now.
There actually are some excellent free marketeers still left in the administration. Great people. I jest.
There are
there are a few.
You can find one if you dig hard enough, I'm sure.
Yeah, they're working away. It's every time. Sometimes I feel for the bureaucracy in Washington, to jump off a little bit, is that they get a bad rap, but everyone I've known who's worked in any of those roles are really smart, really dedicated patriots, working really hard. And can you imagine having the frustration of your boss changing every 48 years and not being able to bitch about it? I think it's just we owe them all Pepto-Bismol for all the ulcers they have to bear. Anyway, so back to BTC BSD.
So, I mean, long and short, that's the very short version of it. Before I start getting super technical about what other things.
You got married in 2015. And
oh, yes.
Did that distract you for a little while?
I took my year off. Right.
So you got married in 2015, and that distracted you from all things Bitcoin for a while.
And I mean, I was still a Bitcoin investor and everything else, but it was, I'm going to enjoy my wife. We were going to have a honeymoon period, right? And so Then 2017 started to happen. Like all of a sudden, Ethereum got very popular. The ICO bubble started to really heat up. And then the market started to perk back up. And I was like, oh, hey, it looks like Bitcoin's going to go out for a run. Like, this is interesting. And I started having people pinging me and like, hey, Kurt, this is what you were talking about a few years ago, right? It looked like, it turns out it didn't die. Maybe you were right about it. And I was like, oh, yeah, I'll get back involved. And so I had a lot of people just plainly asking me like, hey, Kurt, how do I get a wallet? How do I get some Bitcoin? That kind of thing. So it was like, I had a lot of casual friends asking me sort of Bitcoin 101 questions. And I decided to do a Facebook Live stream. I would just hop on. I was like, you know what? I'm going to go on for 10 minutes every day at noon until everybody in my Facebook friends list has heard how to do your Bitcoin stuff. And then I can just reference a video. I'll go from there. And it turned into me. I have literally been on the air at least once a week, every week since the beginning of 2017, talking about Bitcoin stuff. So
that's great.
Yeah, it's a blast. I love it. I had a radio DJ experience in college that I really enjoyed, and so I'm glad that's made it full circle and that I get to do appearances like this, frankly. But
props to your alma mater. Where'd you go?
I went to Harper College in Palatine, Illinois, actually.
Nice.
So, yeah.
I've been there. That's really great. Excellent. That's a beautiful place.
Yeah, I like to call it Southern Palatine University.
That's really good. That's excellent. That reminds me of a friend of mine went to Hofstra, went to NASA Community College on Long Island. And the joke was Hofstra University is there, and Hofstra is a much more robust, challenging university, and NASA is actually a very good community college in terms of kind of prepping people who need a little more work. Anyway, but he went to NASA Community College. His joke was always that he goes to the second best university on Hempstead Turnpike.
Like it.
That's really excellent.
Yeah, I was always, you know what? I'm such a frugal son of a bitch, man. Like I should have just gone straight to like Northwestern or something. So my great grandfather actually founded one of the colleges at Northwestern. I could have gone there for essentially free.
That's great.
And and I went to Palatine because first of all, it was close, and I was like, you know what? I don't know that really what I want to study, so I don't want to waste a bunch of time in gen eds at like, Chicago's sort of Ivy League school.
Sure.
And then I ended up dropping out in year 2 because I had started a business that was like exploding. And so I was like, well, I quit. And I was the Honor Society president when I dropped out, which was also pretty controversial.
That's
for everyone
awesome.
There.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was something, but I actually really liked that school. It was a good time. But anyhow, back to Bitcoin. So in 2017, I came back and I was answering questions, and I realized that the sort of Bitcoin debate of like, what is Bitcoin for? What can it do? Had gotten really, really out of hand. Like it went the other direction than I thought it would. I thought the big block version of Bitcoin made so much obvious sense and that the typical Bitcoiner was so much wiser than the typical person that of course they're going to agree with me and go the direction that I would have gone. And I was very, very wrong on that point.
Was this the first or 45th time your illusions have been shattered?
In the Bitcoin space, this is probably the third time my illusions have
big
been
illusion shattered. Okay, that's not bad.
It's all right. Yeah,
it's all right.
So
it's a healthy ratio to disillusionment ratio. That's good.
Yeah, it's not bad at all. So the debate was, okay, what are we going to do? Are we going to upgrade BTC to have bigger blocks and to do all these things, or is there going to be a split and have 2 competing Bitcoin chains, which was at the time a completely unprecedented concept,
right? And
I supported fighting for BTC. I wanted to fight for the upgrade of the main chain, period, forever. I would have done it nonstop. But in August, there had been just a ton of things that went sour. Really nasty social engineering coming from the small blocker crowd, like calling us. I remember them calling us like the corporate takeover attempt of Bitcoin. There's a lot of very like populist Bolshevik sort of tactics. Like they sort of organized their stuff like a general strike. And so they had this like user activated soft fork. They're all wearing like camo hats and things. Like they had like regalia that they were bringing to the fight. And yeah, and it was very like,
it's great to hear about a war you never knew was happening.
Oh man, it was ridiculous. It was so wild. And like there were people on our side getting like their websites were DDoSed off the internet, and then it was threats from anonymous accounts and just all this stuff. And then like it seemed like maybe we're going to get it worked out, and then there was just this giant renege on all of these promises that were made a couple months earlier, and then it was like, holy cow, we are going to split. Like we are having a civil war, straight up secession right now.
And so for those who are unaware of the war for Middle Earth, who was doing the promising and subsequent reneging? And what was there a power structure? There's a group there that controls the code. Like how did all that actually happen?
So there were two major groups. The big blockers were people like Bitcoin.com and BitPay, which was like the biggest credit card Bitcoin company at the time. Coinbase was actually on the big blocker side at the time, which is funny now in hindsight. And a number of other players, but like the big names were guys like Roger Ver, as well as Jihan Wu, who was the CEO of Bitmain, which was they were like the biggest player in Bitcoin's infrastructure by a very wide margin at the time. And then on the other side were companies like Blockstream, Lightning Labs, some of these other, and like big VC. And what I came to realize after the fact, I did not realize this until about a year after it had all washed out, is that a lot of these venture capital firms were actually funding both sides of this fight, which led me to saying that the entire thing was AstroTurf, and people like me were caught in the middle, trying to have this fight, and it was like, oh, both sides were getting paid, and the VCs made out either way. Like, color me shocked, right?
Well, I lived in Southern Africa for a long time, and the Oppenheimers from De Beers, everyone thinks they were banned from coming to the United States because they ran a monopoly. Yeah, like we care that you got a monopoly on diamonds. You're selling, you love-struck fools who want to be married to this girl forever. Who cares, right? Yeah. No, it was because they were funding both sides of the Angolan Civil War for like 20 years. They funded that to just keep going on and on. Slightly different because we all weren't actually shooting at each other, but similar idea. So that's great. Of course, the Valley was hedging bets. They donate to both political parties. The same thing.
Sure, and I don't want to act like it's some kind of like crazy reptilian conspiracy either, which a lot of people will tell, oh, Kurt's just a conspiracy theorist. And it's like, no. Like this is how business works, and it's all publicly verifiable. So you can go look at like one of the major firms, and I mention them a lot because they're the biggest, and they were the first serious incubator that was venture backed, and they're called Digital Currency Group. The CEO is a guy named Barry Silbert, who's an old Wall Street guy. But then on their board of advisors are guys like Larry Summers from the Clinton administration, or they got guys from Bain Capital, Silver Lake, and some of these other firms. And so these are the guys that are putting tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars into companies on both sides of the spectrum, and have these massive conflicts of interest. And so basically what happened is Bitcoin Cash, the BCH ticker, split away from BTC in 2017 in order to maintain the unbroken chain of digital signatures, which is how Satoshi Nakamoto, the creator of Bitcoin, described a Bitcoin. This is the fundamental definition of a Bitcoin, is an unbroken chain of digital signatures that synchronizes back to the Genesis block and blah, 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 blah. BTC says, screw the digital signatures. What we're going to do is we're going to aggregate those signatures, replace them with a hash, and that hash is an attestation that those signatures exist. And the hash will say that the network witnessed those signatures, but you may not have access to them, essentially, unless you ask. And so it changed the trust model, and therefore the very definition of a Bitcoin on the BTC network, which for me was, that's not what I signed up for. Like,
now, let me interrupt you because hearing that, what I'm hearing, absent there being kind of political or economic motivations for that change, what I'm hearing is that sounds computationally efficient. Right, like for example, just without even thinking about a computer code, I can look at a chain of titles to my buddy's big pile mansion built in 1400s in southern England, right? And we could go through every single scrap of vellum that goes back to the original title granted, or we could look at the current one, which references a legal opinion saying we've examined the chain of custody, and it appears unbroken, and therefore this is a valid title. So that seems to be one non-contentious explanation for why you would switch to that.
I agree that your example would be non-contentious, and I would argue that your example is what Bitcoin does, or what it should do, frankly. Now, my question would be, would you take a letter from an attorney that has his signature on it on their letterhead and say, I'm not willing to show you the title, but I would like you to take this letter as an attestation that the title exists and be happy with it?
It's a whole lot weaker. It sounds like
Yeah.
Reagan's trust but verify. I'll take your letter, but if I want to see the chain, I can see the chain. That would seem
Correct.
to be the rational way to approach that.
And this and that's the nature of the argument, is that, what is Bitcoin for? And Bitcoin is designed to reduce the need for trust because you can verify it yourself at will. And this removed that. And so for me, it's very philosophical. Bitcoin solved a very specific problem and did it in a very specific way. And if Bitcoin is not a consistent rules enforcement framework, then it's all out the window. And it's the same. I would make the same argument about the Constitution. Like if you want to change it however you want to change, like if you can just go to a judge and a judge can say, today you have this right and tomorrow you don't, well, then the Constitution isn't really worth the hemp it's written on, right?
Yeah, well, back to hemp farming. George Washington had big plots, but it's the interesting point you made about what trustless meant, right, or means. Because how I understood trustless to mean was not that I can verify it, but that a majority of a sufficiently large N have verified it, and
Correct.
therefore you can't. It's so insanely unlikely to get this number of people who literally don't know each other to collude on a wrong answer. So I trust the majority answer, even though I myself can't go verify it on my own. Is that a separate definition of trust?
So I would agree with that definition. Small block or BTC people would not. They would tell you that you must run your own infrastructure. Like, you must be an infrastructure participant in the network, because to trust anyone at all, aside from validating your own Bitcoins, is broken. Like, you will be screwed. You are
How would they expect that system to ever scale? That can't work.
They don't believe that it should. And that's exactly the point. The point is that this is why the 1 megabyte block size limit. They don't want the chain to become so big that you cannot validate your own transactions.
Huh. That would seem to not be what Satoshi wanted or designed this for.
Precisely.
I just became a big blocker.
Yes.
I didn't even know that existed until just a moment ago. And now here I am. Look, that was a quick conversion. Well done. Well, how do we take down these small blockers?
Man, I'm
jesting aside. Now that I'm converted, I completely understand why we're right and they're wrong. But why? Are a number of those people, kind of in your opinion, really jesting aside, convinced that this was just a more efficient way to handle this, and any doubts about it are really kind of angels on the head of the pin, philosophical differences that don't really matter? Do you think they believe that, or they've been told that by the winning hand of the VC that put up the $1 billion that's now worth $30 billion?
I think just like most things, it's a very serious mix of both. Right. And I think there are a lot of people that look at Bitcoin, BTC, and they see the meme, freedom money and all this other stuff. They buy in. Then it rewards them monetarily for having participated. And then at that point, when I show up and say, well, this thing that made you wealthy or whatever is bad because X, and then I just, I'm like the guy on the street corner, at your favorite festival saying, repent, Jesus saves, right? I just look like the asshole who's trying to ruin your party. And so,
so wait, now I'm concerned. Did I just join the Westboro Baptist Church of Bitcoin?
No, you did not. So
gotta be careful when I throw my allegiance around so readily.
on the flip side, there are some very specifically and definitely malicious actors on the BTC side who, in my opinion, orchestrated the sort of social engineering aspect of all of this in very nefarious ways, very effectively. Giant censorship campaigns. These are the people that I call the social justice warriors in the BTC camp. Where if you say like, oh, hey, very interesting, Satoshi said he thought that tokens would be a good idea, and then it's like, ban him from the subreddit, and report him to, literally everywhere. Like, make sure all of his accounts are gone. And then we were going to make memes about, like, he is a fool, tax cheat, pedophile, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And like, we saw that pattern happen very quickly, where if you came out as even a lukewarm, like, I'm a very reasonable, maybe big blocker. Like, what if we did 2 megabytes? I'm not talking gigabyte blocks, any of this stuff. Like, hey, you know what? I think the network could probably handle 2 megabyte blocks. It was, you get out of here. Like, you're funded by, it's just like, it's Republicans and Democrats. It's you're funded by George Soros, or you're funded by the Koch brothers, and there's nothing in between. And it's exactly that. So
for those people who are still following this, aside from the inherent religious value of these wars, who's winning economically and losing versus 1 or 3 megabyte blocks? I'm really honestly still grappling with that. Like, how do I get paid more by restricting block size versus just whatever economic activity happens?
So I like to give an example of like, a drug company, for example. And I think people will be very familiar with this example. If cancer could be cured for a $1 pill, what is the likelihood that pill would make it to market? It's essentially zero. So one of the big firms would buy the patent for it, and they would shelve it in order to continue to sell you chemotherapy and the other stuff that is profitable. Now, that's a very Machiavellian way to look at all business, but I think it's more true than not. There would be some variation on that story that would be reality. And Bitcoin, going back to 2012, 2013, when you look at the people who were involved, it was, oh my gosh, like, we're going to replace MasterCard and Visa and PayPal.
Right.
Like, these companies are going to cease to exist because they have now been superseded by a technology that makes them completely obsolete.
Yep.
And so very quickly, MasterCard and Visa and PayPal, and being companies that are run by intelligent people who want to make money, very clearly, okay, let's put some feelers out. Let's figure out let's learn. Is there a way that we can integrate with these things? Like, how do we perpetuate our business? Is there a way that we can perpetuate our businesses with the technology? And the answer comes back to, well, you can't unless you change it pretty significantly, but still keep that underlying, the hopeful aspect of Bitcoin, changing the world. Let's change the world together. Let's not it be Bitcoin. It's Bitcoin sponsored by Cash App. Like, that's a much better sounding thing.
Right.
And so things like Cash App or things like Lightning Network, like, these are all companies that fall into these portfolios. So if you look at companies like Lightning Labs and Blockstream and some of these other companies that do BTC infrastructure, they're in portfolios with MasterCard Ventures, for example, is a major investor in Blockstream Corporation. And so MasterCard now has all kinds of blockchain patents, and they make money on selling access to side chains. And by selling, like, hey, here's a Bitcoin debit card. You can spend your Bitcoin at the grocery store with your MasterCard. And it's like, why have you inserted yourself in the middle? Like, a real Bitcoiner should look at that and say, well, that's a giant loss. But they've been programmed to say, Bitcoin is nothing but this store of value. You put your money into Bitcoin, it goes up in value, and then you can spend it when you want using your MasterCard or your Visa or your whatever. And that's the narrative that has come out. And it's very, very, like, it sounds like a good thing. This is what they're doing in El Salvador. Like, use the Strike app. The Strike app connects to Lightning Network, and Strike is a Visa partner, and so you can trust the this and that. And it's like, first of all,
so that is interesting, because that's one of the first countries that's really gone this route. And what is your understanding of how that's worked out? And is it functioning well, or?
I mean, it's been real rough on their books, I'll tell you that much. They bought the top. They're way underwater. From a usability standpoint, the wallets weren't working because Bitcoin BTC does not scale. It really genuinely doesn't work. As I understand it, they made a deal with another blockchain called Algorand, which is a small sort of proprietary proof of stake network that has really high throughput because it only has a few nodes and it's very centralized. And what they did is they built a government official wallet called Chivo.
Yep.
And Chivo uses Algorand, and it tokenizes BTC, pretends you're using Lightning Network, but you're actually using tokenized BTC over Algorand, Meanwhile, the president's out there calling everyone who isn't, solely devoted to BTC some kind of shitcoiner spy or whatever. And then, just like any good government, like also we're in bed with the enemy who we've been criticizing on stage today. So
wow, so that's interesting. So because they bought at the top and they gave it out to a bunch of people. I'd heard someone say who knew a little bit about it that the price of Bitcoin itself is not really relevant to the functionality of an individual El Salvadoran who is using the wallet to buy or sell something, right? Because if you're using it as an intermediary and the country is already dollarized, right? They don't have an independent currency. So, well, I guess from a governmental balance sheet perspective, they're seeing a loss because the Bitcoin they bought went down.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, for the person who's using it, if it was denominated in dollars, it's just a smoother transaction. But you're saying the way they've structured it is not taking advantage of Bitcoin as Satoshi wrote it, and therefore the efficiencies are not there.
Yep.
And therefore, it's pointless, or it could become useful. I'm just kind of curious.
I mean, in my opinion, I look at what is his name, Nayib Bukele, as he's a globalist, sort of fascist dictator wannabe.
Many people are. To be fair.
Yeah. Well, and I think he's young, and I think he looks at the sort of young and cool technocrat elite of first world countries in his proximity and says, you know what, this is my way to end up maybe bringing my country onto the world stage by sort of hitching my wagon to
real problems, right? I mean, this is one of those headaches. Like, you're trying to fix a serious issue.
Yeah, I mean, they're one of the poorest countries in the world.
Yeah, the last country that successfully dragged itself out of poverty to prosperity was China, and they did it through dictatorial means. Although, actually, for 25 years, they were actually a fairly good free market economy until President Xi arrived. Different issue entirely. But it's curious. From a mechanics standpoint, I think this point, I think, is most useful to my listeners who are trying to be engaged a bit. That if the technology as implemented has actually changed from the protocol that was actually designed to create frictionless micropayments that were supposed to actually help the poor rather than hurt the poor, rather than I'm thinking about your example of by tying a wallet to another network to another provider, it almost sounds like you go to the grocery store and you pay in cash, right? And the bill is $94. And you take out $100 bill, and just as you're about to hand it to the clerk, someone else steps in front of you, takes $9 out of it, gives them 91, and now you still owe them $3, and thank you because that was helpful. Or is that kind of a good analogy?
That is a very good analogy for what BTC has become. It's literally deprecated features under the auspices of making it more secure. So there's this notion that if it's slower and harder to use, that the security of it has gotten better, and that's the trade-off. That the only thing that matters is completely unstoppable large payments, which, I think about who needs completely unstoppable large payments, and I picture very wealthy people and criminals, both of which did not really need their payments ability disrupted and improved, in my opinion.
They're doing just fine as it is. Yes. I love this insane argument from law enforcement that, Bitcoin enabled money laundering and drugs and prostitutes. I'm like, I'm sorry, they were really good at that before Bitcoin existed.
No, they had that figured out.
Really. Their entire merchant banks and law firms up and down a street in Miami that have been doing that very well and very respectfully for a long time. Without getting myself thrown to the alligators. I'm just kidding. So, but theoretically, that could be possible.
Yeah, so, anything could happen.
Anything can happen. So, all right, that's interesting. So all those changes now, where do you see things sitting now? Like, so I've referenced BSV, and I did the horrible thing I never explained. That's what it's called, Bitcoin Satoshi variant.
Satoshi Vision. So it's basically like we took the things that Satoshi said about Bitcoin that everyone tried to eliminate, like literally social engineer them out of existence, and said, hey, before the network even launched, Satoshi said that Bitcoin could outcompete Visa today with existing hardware and no need for a protocol change.
Right.
Like what did that mean? Does that deserve to be explored? And
well, actually, really quickly, I want to circle back very swiftly to the idea that features were truncated in BTC, right? I had a discussion with someone a couple of days ago, and his comment was, I thought interesting, that the rationale for trimming an individual's ability to modify the code was, if you're not really good at what you're doing, you can get yourself into a lot of trouble. You could, for example, create a locking password or mechanism that is insoluble. So, and once you implement it, suddenly you're locked out of your own Bitcoin, and no one in the universe except God can help you, because that's how the code works. And the idea was, well, maybe that's like handing an AK-47 to a 4-year-old, and maybe we shouldn't let the 4-year-old have the AK-47. Are some of the changes made, do those make sense in those terms, that like lack of expertise could let you get into a lot of trouble?
Certainly some. And that was the precedent by which a lot of the things that I think were malicious was built upon. So back in 2011, like right when Satoshi Nakamoto left, the guy in charge was a guy named Gavin Andresen, who was a guy who Satoshi did not ask to leave in charge. Satoshi said, here's the keys, peace out. And Gavin's like, I don't want to be the lead developer here. And he immediately brought in a number of other maintainers. I think it was 4 other people he gave key access to. Said, okay, we're like this committee of 5. We're sort of like this, Supreme Court council as to what changes will be made. And then for him, like Gavin's a very, what's the word? Systematic. Like he's going to comb through things. Like, okay, what am I actually in charge of here? Right. And he very quickly said,
"Okay, happy that people take their responsibility seriously in this world. That's good news."
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, you inherited an apartment building in kind of a weird neighborhood, and it's like, well, okay, I can't run security cameras to every door, so I'm going to bolt up all the doors that I can't watch from my desk for a while, right?
Right.
And so that's a lot what happened. Is
that's not a bad analogy. That's actually pretty good. Until I get a grip on things here, I want to make sure that I'm not just letting crazy stuff happen.
Okay. Exactly. And so a lot of things it came from Gavin's, good faith effort to not break Bitcoin while he got a grasp on it. But then it turned into, every time it was like, okay, guys, here's what we can do with like OpReturn, for example. There's this group that wants to make tokens and put a piece of code in OpReturn that settles on chain if you make a transaction that does X. And immediately it's like, no, we agreed that was unsafe. And it was like, yeah, 3 years ago we thought it was unsafe, but we've been in charge here for a while now. I think we got a grip on things. And then it was, no, if you do that, we're gonna kick you out, essentially. Like, so very quickly it was like, Satoshi created this for a reason. Like maybe we should see what that's for. Like we can test it in testnet. Like we can create side networks that are one-to-one with Bitcoin and make one change at a time and see what happens. And it just was no. And then the roadmap very quickly turned into, all right, well, it's been 3 or 4 years since we've used any of this stuff. Let's just completely sunset it and let's add these new things over here, which we've already pre-vetted. This is fine. And so then it turned into, okay, now we're not, like, we have turned off Satoshi's ideas, and now we're adding ideas of, some developer who showed up in an open source project and, decided he was an economist or, whatever else. And it's like, okay. The other problem that it introduces is sound money. I mean, what hard money can be changed by committee? Like if gold could be changed by a group of people saying, okay, gold is this now. Well, all of a sudden gold doesn't have nearly the value it does. And so,
well, in a world where recession changes constantly, who knows? Anything's possible. So is Satoshi kind of like Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi? He's alone on a very tall mountain in the middle of an ocean somewhere, and people want to reach him, but he's got no internet connection.
For a time, yes, and I think the Satoshi story still has a lot of very foggy mirrors to look at it through. I think the one thing that is very clear is that Craig Wright, the most difficult, pain in the ass, disliked, and dislikable, unlikable, I don't know what the word is, but
what a funny guy for all that.
You know what? A hell of a drinking buddy, let me tell you. I think it's very clear that he wrote the white paper and created the moniker of Satoshi. And so everything else, like who coded it, who audited it, who did the security stuff, who implemented it the first time. I think there's pretty good evidence that it was like 3 or 4 other people that kind of did the nuts and bolts stuff. And so I like to give the building analogy again. Like every building has an architect,
Right.
and every architect knows the architects who build the buildings in town. But if you're one of the bricklayers, you know the bricklayers in town. And so
Yeah.
I think there were a number of bricklayers, and Craig Wright was the architect. And so he had disappeared. He indeed went off and did his own thing for a few years between 2011 and 2015, when he was outed by Wired and Gizmodo magazines against his will. He denied that he was Satoshi very vehemently for a good amount of time. Frankly, it pushed him from his home. He ended up leaving Australia forever in 2015. Was in, I don't know if in hiding is exactly the right word, but he made it to the UK to be safe. And again, didn't want to be a public person, and was really bullied by the media for some time, until he finally in 2017, 18 was like, I guess I'm just going to own this thing and come
Right.
out and really start to explain, like, amid this Bitcoin civil war, he was a lot less genteel than I would be, to the point where if it was, I don't know if your podcast here is PG-13 or what, but he'd be up on stage, and it wasn't like, here's why this might be a bad idea. It was, if you want to do this, you're creating your own thing. Fuck you, get off my network.
Right.
And to which everybody was, oh my fragile sensibilities.
Well, it's funny because I had him on Messy Times, and we had a great chat, and I very deliberately, because I frankly I hadn't heard of this whole controversy whatsoever. I always assumed, well, like, someone's got to be Satoshi, and my thought was always it was a group of people, and so I've got no opinion particularly, right? And so we had a really great chat, I think, because I never asked him about it. I don't care. Like the stuff he's doing at Enchain, and because we both have spent time building exchanges in the past, right? So I really just want to have a chat about the kind of what he certainly knows about this space really well. Maybe because he created it, maybe not. Don't care. But I think it was a fundamentally really interesting conversation, because I never asked him, because I've seen a couple other clips where people get on and instantly challenge him. I don't care, frankly, until someone else puts their head up above the parapet and says it's me. He may as well be, and whatever. So it's. But everything that I'm thinking back to the conversation he and I had both on air and off was around the uses. One of the things that he said that I thought was that's taken me a few weeks to really absorb. So, well, there can, it's kind of like the Highlander, there can be only one blockchain, right? Much like there's only one internet. Similarly, you can build separate subnets. You could have an internal intranet in your corporation, but it doesn't change the nature of the protocols by which the system operates.
Correct.
And maximum efficiency means you don't want to have gates and off ramps and all these different bridges that charge you to move from one to another. That's just rent seeking. That's kind of like my example, the guy who suddenly stands between you and the cashier and asks for $9 of your $100 for the privilege of handing the 91 over to the cashier.
Right.
So that makes a huge amount of sense.
No, and that's how I feel about it too. You know a good tree by its fruit, basically. And so, Craig, like I said, I mean, he's pedantic, he's a pain in the ass, and all these other things. But when you talk to him about Bitcoin, like when you don't challenge him on the Satoshi stuff, and you actually just start to say, like, hey, I think actually the best example, to see somebody's reaction about a thing, like, hey, are you this person, rather than saying, are you Satoshi? I think the most interesting thing is to ask him very lightly known things about Bitcoin. And so I watched somebody ask him about, it may have been the first bug that Satoshi ever patched, and they call it the one return bug. And what it was is there was a code that allowed nodes to collectively spend anything, like move a transaction without you moving the transaction, which today is like, well, Bitcoin can't do that. That's the point of Bitcoin.
Right.
And I watched somebody say, what happened with the one return bug? How did that get pushed? And he immediately, he's like, it wasn't a bug. And this is a thing that, like,
here's why we had it, right?
It was a thing that, honestly, less than 100 people on Earth even know that the one return thing ever existed. And it wasn't like a, hold on, let me fish for an answer. It was it was so mad we had to turn that off. And he goes, why?
I fought and yelled about that for weeks. Right.
Right. And he goes and goes and goes. And he's like, there's a reason I use the term honest when I describe nodes. So an honest node, if honest nodes do a thing, it's like, imagine if somebody steals your Bitcoin, and then you can prove that it was your Bitcoin. You can prove it unequivocally. Here's when I bought it. Here's the chain of custody. And here's the bastard that stole it. Here's the transaction. Here's where they are now. Should those coins be yours? Should they be returned? If one return was still allowable in script, you could just show it to the nodes, and nodes would move it right back to your thing. And everybody's good to go. This is how the world works, And he's like, and it's like, not prompted, not scripted. Nobody knew he was going to be asked that question. And you're like, okay, so this is one of those things. It's like when you go talk to a guy who, like, worked as a manufacturer at, like, General Motors for years.
And you say, oh my God, we had one machine in the middle that if you didn't kick it every 14th revolution,
exactly,
stutter, right? You had to oil it as it was moving, or exactly.
Yes, he knows the thing that you could only know if you were there.
That's helpful. And I want to circle back to something that's come up a couple of times, and I'll tell you why. So you spoke about tokenization a couple of times, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because one of my mining company firms, hard rock mining, not Bitcoin mining, we're in the process of structuring basically a tokenization, an NFT, whatever the structure will be. Because I love the packaging mechanism, right? I've done structured financings in commodities before. To me, there's absolutely no difference. I'm just taking the blockchain technology and enabling this to be a smoother transfer with an immutable order chain and all that great stuff. That basically, technology to me has always been a way of smoothing human processes, removing the pointless parts of what humans do, so humans can do the creative parts. And so we're tokenizing this to kind of set of commodity rights and privileges and options and the rest of it. And the reason I thought about it is you just talked about this one return thing. One thing that has made the people who were buying these from us, our customers, happy is I've said, well, this is not completely decentralized, because it's going to be book entry validated, meaning you buy NFTs number 43 through 48, right? And part of the agreement is you have to come back through me to sell it to someone else. I'm not going to charge you, but you have to do it through us, mainly for KYC AML reasons, right? Like, I can't sell these to you and then you go sell it to, an Iranian terrorist. Like, I'm not allowing that transaction to happen. So in the case where you, Bob, own these 3, and a year later, Sally shows up and wants to redeem them, I'm going to call you first and say, did you sell them? Naughty, you shouldn't have, but okay, we'll fix it. Or more likely, Sally stole them. So we're solving through a somewhat cumbersome, decentralized, semi-centralized process, kind of what you just described. Is that fair? So when you talk about tokenization and why, if I had it right, kind of the pure big block kind of vision of how it should work, it supports tokenization, but the small blocks don't. Is that a smart or wrong?
They can. So you can create a token in BTC today, but they are very, very limited. They can only be very simple, and the kind of thing that they can do is just transfer a string of numbers from one address to the next. You can't attach, like, you might be able to make an NFT, but it'd be tight. Like, the limitation is, I believe it's 40 kilobytes.
It's tiny.
I think it's 40 kilobyte limitation of how much code you
That's
can
not even a passport photo. It's normal resolution. That's nothing.
Exactly. But it's just code. Like, so if you can make a real slim piece of JavaScript or whatever, like, you can make it do a thing, but it takes away a lot of those things. Like, if in your example, if you were to issue a token, you would want the token to require very specific counterparty signatures,
general terms and conditions, which are 60 pages long. There's a lot of stuff in there.
Exactly. And you would want that to be part of the chain of custody of the thing you've tokenized, and you cannot do that on BTC. So this is why BSV matters. But
you can do that on BSV.
It can be, yes. Yeah.
Can be done.
Long story short, yes.
Because you can do essentially there's no limit to the byte size.
Correct. So that's a very short response.
And does that tie into kind of what you're talking about earlier about the economic interest of firms who said, I'm going to carve this out and I only make money if the ability of the code itself is limited. So therefore I want to limit the code because then people have to come to me for the services that otherwise could just go on chain.
Well, I mean, and think about all the things that Bitcoin could disrupt if it was used for everything. I mean, it's title companies, it's notaries, it's all kinds of public attestation. It's even, anything that you need to do like a public announcement. So this would be, home, foreclosures, all of these kinds of things, like all kinds of asset tracking, asset announcement, and tokenization use cases. These things that require counterparties, and basically anything that requires somebody to be a third party and give an attestation for the next economic step to occur can be eliminated by Bitcoin at scale. And then you can add to it the payments use cases and some of the more obvious things like Visa, PayPal, Venmo, Zelle, whatever. It's just as easy for me to send Bitcoin to my next door neighbor as it is for me to send it to somebody in North Korea, frankly. And and nobody can stop it. Not nobody, like it's an absolute statement in a non-absolute world, but in a very basic sense, that's another one of the things that it disrupts. So then that's also disrupting things like ACH, Fedwire.
And for all that stuff, though, that would seem that, unless I'm hearing it incorrectly, that would seem to mean that the 21 million Bitcoins mined, those Bitcoins themselves would be insufficient to manage all those processes. So you're not talking about the Bitcoins being the mediating principle. You're talking about the protocols instantiated in code that would. So the Bitcoin protocol is what could enable a planet of 9 billion people to record all these transactions. You're not going to deal with all of the title changes and all the rest of that you just talked about with 21 million units of something.
Well, it's not 21 million units. So a Bitcoin can be divided into 100 million pieces. So it's actually, I think it's 2.1 quadrillion units.
So the fractionalization makes this possible because once you use that unit, in fact, you don't need it anymore. It gets passed to someone else conceptually.
Correct. But you can also even lock up, like, let's say in 1,000 years or whatever, we're getting to the point where it's like there's not enough Bitcoins for everybody to do a thing. So you can actually lock up a single unit. They call the unit the Satoshi, the sat. You can lock one up in a smart contract and then issue fractional sats as well. So I could issue a millisat or a billisat or whatever.
In that sense, it's like a fractal. You can repeat the pattern
infinitely. It's infinite.
And how does that account for what's the percentage of current Bitcoins that have been mined that are now lost, thrown away? People lost the passcodes, they died without telling people. That's a severe limitation, right? I mean, that's like buried gold treasure in an island.
Hence one return, for example. I mean, maybe every 50 years, if a coin hasn't moved in a generation, like you make a public announcement, like, hey, whoever owns these keys, if you don't own these keys, then whatever. On this date in 1 year, these coins are going to be remined and redistributed. Like
that's the global lost luggage bin.
Essentially, I mean, so like that is a thing too. I mean, like people have these notions that it's lost forever, and Satoshi absolutely did say, like, if you lose your coins, you should consider them like a donation to the community by you're adding to its scarcity, basically.
Right.
But on the same hand, like there's no real reason why you can't decide among nodes to say, hey, okay, there's 8 million coins that have been unmoved for 100 years, and therefore they're not anybody.
The owner is dead.
Yes. Right. Like, so we'll make a public announcement. We'll do it the same way that you would take an old property.
They do that now with all sorts of assets now. Like,
put it in the newspaper. You got to wait 90 days. You pay the tax, and whatever. So
cool. We can go on and on and on forever, but I think you've got other things to do with your time. I'm fascinated. I think also my listeners begin to run out of patience with my verbosity. But this is absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for taking the time. We will have to have a rematch. I think there are a lot of interesting things to talk about. We didn't touch on Ethereum and Cardano and
no, anything. I'd be happy to come back. We can talk about all of that.
That's killer. And any kind of final thoughts and words for people who are really want to dive into the space to get a better grip on many of the things you touched on?
Sure. I mean, you can check me out at CoinGeek.com or KurtWuckertJR.com. I answer my DMs on social media if anybody just wants to ask a question. My advice: anybody that knows what they're talking about in this space also has a conflict of interest, and you need to be very, very careful what they're telling you. So
that is always true. Someone is always talking their book. Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. I learned long ago a partner at Schroeder's, who I didn't work for years ago, but I met him because we lived in the same neighborhood and he used to walk dogs together. Funny guy. So I was probably 25, 26, started down on Wall Street. He was, 70, walking his, running his Rottweiler Rescue Foundation. Crazy guy. Anyway, one of the best lines ever. He said, I was telling you about something I had heard that, this is the .com era, remember? This is like 98, yep. 97, 98.
Sure.
And he said, and he heard me out because I wasn't quite sure. I ran it by him because it sounded like, maybe a little too good to be true. And he looked at me and said, Christopher, I'm going to tell you something. Whenever I see something like that, the first and only question I ask myself is, why is Santa Claus landing on my front lawn in August? And when I put everything since then, I put through that filter. And if I don't find out that he filed a flight plan and he had to be here, it's not true. So
for sure,
buyer beware. But Kurt, thank you so much. And to my fervent listeners, just remember, turn off the mainstream media. They are lying to you for profit, and tune into Messy Times. Until next time, thanks so much.
Thanks, Chris.